Hello everyone. After Firouzja's surprise victory over Carlsen in the first round, Firouzja faces Praggnanandhaa this time. We'll see if he confirms his form in this Norway chess tournament. Firouzja has white and opens with the pawn to d4, and black responds symmetrically with d5. c4, the queen's gambit, e6, black declines. And here both players develop their knights, knight f3, knight f6, and knight c3. And we remember that Carlsen played h6 here against Firouzja in that first round. But this time black isn't going to play h6, they're going to play c6. Now it's solid, but it allows the bishop to come out to g5, the pin, knight d7. And now an important moment, Firouzja is going to change the pawn structure by taking on d5. Now when I say change the pawn structure, not really. Black could very well recapture with the c6 pawn on d5, and we'd have a symmetrical pawn structure, except that Firouzja has already developed his bishop before playing e3. Whereas black would have the bishop locked in since e6 has already been played. That's why black doesn't want to recapture with the c6 pawn on d5, so as not to leave a structure of pawns that ultimately favors white because the bishop is out. And the black recaptures instead with the e6 pawn on d5, and after e3 we have this particular pawn structure called the Carlsbad. Firouzja has the semi-open c file and black has the semi-open e file. So generally, white can deploy play on the queen side, and black can play in the center. Not always in the center though, when white hasn't put the knight on f3. White can look to play the f3 and e4 sequence and activate their pawn majority in the center. But here, since the knight is on f3, the f2 pawn is blocked, it's more complicated to unlock this situation. So in the position, black is going to play h6 here. They challenge the bishop, they want to get rid of the pin, but Firouzja keeps it, bishop h4. Black plays g5, bishop g3. Now it's true that black got rid of the bishop, there's no more pin, but it's at the cost of weakening the kingside castling. Nevertheless, if white themselves look to do kingside castling, they could face a pawn storm from the h6 and g5 pawns, so it's not easy to know where the kings will take shelter in reality. Maybe they can also do queenside castling, that's what we'll see. Knight h5 is played. So we see that black wasn't just looking to get rid of the pin, they're hunting the bishop of black squares. They want to unbalance this position and notably unbalance the color game. Take good note of what I just told you, unbalancing the color game. Because what's going to happen now, this inevitable exchange of the knight for the dark squared bishop will lead to a strategic game around attacks on light squares and dark squares that will decide the entire strategy for the rest of the game. It's fundamental to understand this now. I'm going to explain it to you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to hold your hand to help you understand this color strategy. So let me explain. If black plays knight takes bishop, white will probably recapture with the h2 pawn on g3, and black will have the pair of bishops and therefore the only dark squared bishop. Black will therefore have to look to fight on the dark squares with this bishop. We also notice that Firouzja's pawn structure is quite solid on the dark squares. And Firouzja will have to look for the fight on the light squares, because while he doesn't have a dark squared bishop, he has an extra piece compared to his opponent to fight on the light squares. And Firouzja spots a weakness of his opponent on the light squares. It's this f5 square. And so he puts the bishop on d3. There is this exchange, knight takes g3, pawn takes, bishop g7, and queen c2. By moving the queen to c2, it finally gives the king the option to do either kingside or queenside castling. But the queen on c2 also joins the bishop in controlling the f5 square. With this possibility of playing bishop f5 and finally breaking black's bishop pair, if the knight on d7 moves, we could have this exchange of light squared bishops. And besides, knight b6 is played. Firouzja is in no hurry to play bishop f5. He doesn't need to break the opponent's bishop pair, especially since the bishop on c8 is currently passive and the bishop on d3 doesn't just act on this diagonal. It also monitors this diagonal, and specifically the penetration square on c4 that the knight might look for. And Firouzja is going to decide to do queenside castling. Note that there has already been a game in this position between Caruana and Gukesh where both players opted for kingside castling. Gukesh had white, by the way, if I remember correctly. He had done kingside castling and Caruana had done kingside castling. But here in the game, both players are going to opt for queenside castling. Exactly in the same pawn structure with the same piece placement. Quite amusing. So queenside castling is played. The bishop develops to a6, king b1. It's often the case when doing queenside castling to shift the king. It also allows the c1 square to be freed for the rook, and that's what Firouzja will do here, placing his rook on the semi-open file. Queen to e7, he plays rook c1, queenside castling, and then knight f4. The black can take, but the queen will take back and finally approach the defensive walls of the black's queenside castling. But the knight has 4. Why is it coming there? Not really to take the black knight, it's coming there to occupy the outpost on c5. But what is an outpost in chess? You identify the semi-open file, that is a half-open file, and the last square exploitable by a knight is what we call an outpost. This will finally allow the knight to approach the black position. And if black tries to dislodge this knight, for example with the push to b6, well, since the outpost is located on a semi-open file, it weakens the defenses of the c6 pawn, which will be exposed to attacks from heavy pieces. So Firouzja is looking to enter c5. Black shift their king themselves to avoid staying in this face-off. Knight comes to c5. The rook moves to c8. The queen moves to b3, and here we understand there are face-offs, queen-king face-off, pressure on b7, even if the knight on b6 is there. We see that Firouzja is organizing his game to launch an assault on the black king, but there's nothing direct for now. Black is defending well, especially as they play rook c7. The b7 pawn, the structural base of this pawn chain, is well defended. Rook c3, Firouzja is going to double the rooks on the c file. The king goes to hide on a8, rook c1, and the knight comes to d7. He wants to eliminate the knight on the outpost, and Firouzja agrees. He exchanges, knight takes, bishop takes. Firouzja sends the a4 pawn, but in reality this pawn will struggle to weaken black's pawn structure because if a 5 is played, there could be a 6. But even after a 5, then a 6, b6 could be played, and the c6 pawn is still well held. The bishop, the rook, the other rook could arrive. It's not that easy to break black's pawn structure, especially since the advance of the a pawn also weakens the white king's position. But it's white who is mostly on the attack on this side. Black plays h5. They simply want to open the h-file to give their rook some play, trying, moreover, to divert Firouzja's attention elsewhere to other areas of the board than the king's. Firouzja plays queen c2, so he finally understands that the direct attack against the king isn't working, and he'll look to play bishop f5 to break the pair of bishops of black. And I've mentioned breaking the pair of bishops of black several times now. The idea, in reality, after bishop f5, is that by eliminating the light-squared bishop, we get the famous queen and knight tandem, a very dangerous tandem. And so that's Firouzja's idea. Remove black's bishops and have this queen and knight tandem. h4 is played, takes on h4, and bishop f5. There it is. Bishop f6, bishop, rook takes, and knight to e1. Why does the knight come to e1 now? We were talking about this famous queen and knight tandem, a strong offensive tandem because it's very collaborative. We have all the moves of the game. But the knight on f3 was ultimately dominated in the position. It couldn't go to e5, it couldn't go to g5, it couldn't take the pawn on h4. So Firouzja retreats this knight. Now, you might think that retreating the knight isn't very dangerous, but beware of pieces that retreat. Perhaps they are simply gaining momentum to come back stronger. And the knight on e1 will actually return to d3 and then to c5 on the outpost. And now that black no longer has their light-squared bishop, hence the idea of having removed the light-squared bishop, well, this attack on b7 becomes interesting because if the pawn comes to b6 to dislodge the knight, then the c6 pawn will be very fragile with the tripling of heavy pieces on the c-file. And meanwhile, we see that the black square bishop still can't really join the fight. Queen e4 is played, so black provokes the exchange of queens, so there will be no more problems for their king. And a queen exchange is hard to refuse. Maybe knight d3 could be played, but we'd lose the g2 pawn and the h pawn would run to promotion. So here Firouzja accepts the queen exchange, he takes, and the knight no longer has access to the d3 square. But I remind you of the color game I mentioned at the beginning of the video. White must play on the white squares. They must play and fight on the white squares. Why? Because the opponent has a dark square bishop, so if you fight on the white squares, you have an extra piece. You know what an extra piece means? It's quite important after all. So in this position, you just need to make the dark squared bishop as harmless as possible by not giving it much play. For now, it doesn't have much. It's hard for it to find targets and to find play on the white squares. So how could he find play on the white squares? Well, by attacking the pawn on e4, which isn't that easy to defend, and by exploiting the square on f5, which is also a white square. We can't break b7 and c6, because if we play a 5, there's a 6. So this pawn structure of b7, c6, and a 6 will hold. But the e4 pawn can be vulnerable, and f5 is very interesting for white. It allows attacking the bishop and especially the f7 pawn on a white square, while defending the weak f2 base on a dark square. Black will eventually trade pawns, and will have to defend f2, which holds e3 and d4. The whole pawn chain holds on the dark squares thanks to f2. So Firouzja plays rook c5. He wants to swing his rook to f5. e3 is played, so we have the exchange. Pawn takes, rook takes, and there it is, rook f5. Look at how the rook will defend the structural base on the dark square and start attacking the dark squared bishop, but also the pawn on f7 behind it, because if the dark squared bishop can move, the pawn itself cannot. And then the rook can sometimes drop back to f4 to attack the pawn on e4, which is going to be surrounded, it's cornered. Black plays rook d6 to defend the bishop laterally. Knight c2, Firouzja is going to find a very strange path for the knight so that it can come and attack the pawn on e4. The idea is for it to end up on c3 to attack that pawn. I don't even remember the path this knight took to go and attack the pawn on e4. We'll find out, it'll be fun, we'll see what path it took. Black plays a6, the rook to g1, king a7, the rook to g4, there we go. We're attacking the pawn on e4 here and forcing rook e6 to defend. And you see the pawn on e4, it's the one that's going to feel Firouzja's wrath. Knight b4 is played. Now the computer doesn't really like this knight b4 move, but it's going to be the architect of Firouzja's victory. Rook comes to h6, the knight goes to a2 to precisely return to c3 and attack this pawn on a4 twice. Rook g6, a proposal to exchange rooks to remove precisely the rook that's attacking e4. So rook takes, pawn takes, the white rook drops back and still attacks the pawn on e4. And now you understand, after knight c3, the pawn on e4 is lost. And so black is looking to find play on the dark squares because they're going to lose on the white squares. They're going to lose a pawn anyway. So they go all in and play c5. It's a nice idea though, it won't work at all, but it's a nice idea. See, after the capture on c5, the bishop is freed. So it controls the c3 square so that the knight has trouble getting to c3. And especially look how far he pushes his idea of playing on dark square. He plays b6. Because if he takes, the rook will be able to take back and we'll have an attack on the b2 pawn. Since we can't reach the f2 pawn, we're going to attack the b2 pawn. But Firouzja is not going to take this pawn on b6. He's going to play knight b4. And he's looking for the d5 square here, a light square as always. Pawn takes, knight d5 attacks the bishop that goes to g5, rook g4, the bishop retreats to d8, and the knight ends up repositioning on c3. That's it, the e4 pawn falls. Look how Firouzja managed to start attacking all the pawns on light squares, while the dark squared bishop didn't succeed. Firouzja won the color game, and he's going to reap the rewards. He's going to win the first pawns. g5 is played, knight takes a4, rook e5. We see how the knight and the rook are now attacking the c5 and e5 pawns. King c2. We bring the king closer, of course. King b6, king d3, king c6, pawn b3, bishop on e7. And the rook comes to g1. Here Firouzja might want to come to c1 to attack the c5 pawn, or simply come to the h-file, because there can be very interesting squares on the h-file. Maybe the rook will go around. Rook d5 check, king comes to a2, king b6, knight comes to d2, king comes to a5. And the rook repositions to g4 to counter the penetration of the black king on the dark squares. He would like to enter b4. The rook comes to d8, rook e4. We attack the bishop, which retreats to f8, king d1. The king passes under the cover of the knight like a shield to come and join the side of the black king. Rook d6, king c2, rook f6. It attacks the pawn on f2. But what's going to happen now is very nice. Knight c4, check. The king enters b4, and a nice move by Firouzja f3. And the rook suddenly cannot take the pawn, otherwise the knight will move with a check against the king. So the knight will move to f5, and that will allow winning the black rook. The black rook comes to h6 to try to go around, to attack the white king on the second rank, a rank that is weak. But white has the initiative, knight d2 check. And in this position, you know, Firouzja has 44 seconds and black only has 13. So since the 40th move has been reached, both players have a 10-second bonus. But it goes by fast in this position. And here black had to retreat to a5, but they still have a losing position. but black prefers to enter a 3. And here's a nice move by Firouzja, pushing the pawn to a 5 to free up the light square of 4 and threaten mate. And suddenly it's total distress for black, who no longer knows how to avoid mate. They're going to try everything. They'll play rook h4 to propose a rook trade, but f4, obstruction, and rook a4 mate is still threatened. The c4 pawn is played, but rook takes c4, and rook a4 mate is unavoidable, and black resigns. They could still push a bit by playing king a2, but then there would be rook a4 check, the bishop would come to a 3, and now knight c4. So it might not be mate right away, actually, because there could be rook h2 check anyway to dislodge the white king, but the bishop is lost. There will be rook takes bishop no matter what, and certainly the black king will find himself in a mating net anyway in the white camp, on the first rank, in fact. But now it's easy for white. They're going to win a piece and keep all the advantages of the position, actually. Firouzja has 2 wins then. He's alone in the lead in this Norway chess tournament. We'll see how it goes from here. In any case, you can see his opponents. There are 6 of them. So there's Magnus Carlsen, Vincent Kiemer, Alireza Firouzja, Wesley So, Praggnanandhaa, and Gukesh. What are your predictions? You can tell me in the comments, share the video, support the channel, give it a thumbs up. I need your help. I thank you for that gesture. Goodbye, everyone.